Hi there, I'm Phil, and welcome to another of my story analysis videos, where I take a deep dive into a film in terms of its story structure, character arcs, and themes. Today, we're looking at 2001, A Space Odyssey. Make sure you've seen the film, spoilers ahead. 2001, A Space Odyssey was released in 1968, directed by Stanley Kubrick, and written by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke.
This is really Stanley Kubrick's movie. I acted as the first stage booster and provided occasional guidance.
It is, of course, one of the most talked about films of all time, and there are lots of videos on YouTube discussing the visual effects, the models, the meaning behind the story, the meaning behind the ending of the story, the process of how it was made, but very few of them actually dig into the story itself, aside from trying to philosophically understand what it's all about. So I'm not going to talk about the visual effects. I'm not going to talk about the history of how it was made and the people involved. What I'm going to focus on here is the story and the characters, and not so much about all the other wonderful stuff that's in the film that many other people have spoken to already. The story was originally based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke called The Sentinel. Now, The Sentinel was about the discovery on the moon of a pyramid structure buried in the moon, very similar to the second sequence in 2001 where they find the monolith. That was the extent of the short story, where they find this thing and it sends out a radio beacon to Saturn, I believe, in the short story originally, and that's where the story ended. That was originally going to be the basis of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the moon sequence, in fact, was going to feature a pyramidic structure. And at one point it was a translucent structure, like a large slab of glass. They chose the black monolith because it was easier to film. It didn't have as many reflections as a translucent object would. And it becomes a simpler symbol of the alien intelligence it represents. That was the genesis of the story. And Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick worked together to develop in concert the screenplay for the film and the novelization that came from that. Now, there are differences between the screenplay and the novel. And in fact, if you read the novel, which I did many, many years ago, and if you look at the sequel to this film, 2010, the year we make contact, they explain a lot about what's not obvious from 2001 itself. Within the script of 2001, there are also hints of what was intended that aren't actually in the film anymore, that were cut from the film. But let's start at the beginning. The dawn of man. The story is essentially about the human species coming into contact with a superior alien intelligence. This is, by all accounts, a benign alien intelligence. They do not mean us harm. Now, when we begin, in the dawn of man, we have these primitive Homo erectus type humanoid creatures. These are ancient humans. And in fact, 2001 and the original Planet of the Apes came out in the same year, 1968, both with these very advanced prosthetic ape makeup and costumes. Planet of the Apes won a special Oscar for makeup. I don't think they had a category at the time.
How can I follow an act like that?
2001 won for visual effects for Stanley Kubrick.
Mr. Kubrick unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, so we'll have his Oscar delivered to Mars, where he is scouting locations for 2002, Space Odyssey Revisited.
So we start with the dawn of man and we meet these early humans, and they are struggling to survive. They don't have a shelter beyond hiding under a rock, and they are fearful every night of being attacked by leopards and other wildlife, or by other creatures of their own kind. This changes when the monolith appears outside their front door, so to speak, one morning. Now, of course, they're freaked out by it, they don't know how to react to it, but they eventually come to touch it and interact with it and realize it's not going to do them any harm. And what is the monolith? What's it doing there? Well, there's two versions of this, really. One is, it's there to teach them how to use tools, how to become more civilized, how to develop as a species. when they interact with it, it's doing that. It is effectively teaching them, and it's also monitoring them, watching them, seeing how they fare. So that becomes our inciting incident. That leads to our central character, who is Moonwatcher by name, learning how to create a tool, the bone. This becomes the first tool, the first weapon, which he can then use to hunt, to get food, or for self-defense, or indeed offense, in the battle over the waterhole. They are now the dominant tribe here, because they've learned how to use weapons, how to use tools. When he throws that in the air, and it transforms in a match cut into a space vessel, that is actually a flying bomb. Now in the script, there's a whole voiceover narration that explains what that ship is and what others like it that we see are. In the original story, there's this whole setup of a geopolitical tension, and the Earth is surrounded by orbiting nuclear bombs. This is the future that Clarke and Kubrick predicted by the year 2001. That was assuming that the Cold War politics of 1968 continued, that we would have space exploration, which we did have the very next year after all. Apollo 11 landed on the moon the very next year.
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
So it's not an unreasonable expectation that if this continued, we would end up in this gigantic stalemate in space. And in fact, if any of you have seen the TV series For All Mankind, it plays on this idea. What if the Cold War continued for decades to come? In any case, that opening narration was cut from the film, but that explains some of the geopolitical tension that's happening on Earth. And we get a sense of that once we get inside the space station with Dr. Hayward Floyd, and he briefly talks to some Russians that are also there on the station.
Dr. Floyd, I hope you don't think I'm being too inquisitive, but perhaps you can clear up the great big mystery about what has been going on up there.
I'm afraid I don't know what you mean.
Now, this whole sequence, following a new character, Hayward Floyd, on his journey to the moon, and eventually going to the site where they've dug up the second monolith on the moon, up to the point where they touch it and it sets out this massive, intense beam, this radio signal. The opening sequence, The Dawn of Man, and this whole sequence on the moon don't seem to have much to do with each other. And then when we come to the third sequence, which is the flight to Jupiter, it's a whole other sequence with another whole set of characters. This film does not follow a three-act structure, obviously. In fact, you could argue that The Dawn of Man and the moon base sequence are like two giant prologues. When we talk about 2001, we tend to talk about that Jupiter mission, because that's where the story really begins. That's where the human story really begins, in terms of interpersonal conflict. Of course, that's mostly between Dave Bowman and HAL.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
So the A-plot for 2001, what's the A-plot? What's the thing that holds all of this together? What's the major action of the story? It's built around the monolith. The inciting incident is the first appearance of the monolith. The first act's turning point, arguably in the larger structure, is when they discover it on the moon and they touch it yet again. And then the second act turning point is when they arrive at Jupiter and they discover the monolith again. But really, while the monolith holds together that A-plot, it is the mission of this alien intelligence watching us and waiting for us to become a spacefaring species, to the point where we can reach the moon and find it, and to the point where we can reach Jupiter and then interact with the giant one that's floating outside Jupiter. Once we get to Jupiter, they figure these humans are probably mature enough now for us to make contact with. That's the underlying A-plot, and then in fact carries forward into the sequel, 2010, which is called 2010, the year we make contact. But that isn't really a three-act structure. We have like two very separate prologues with The Dawn of Man and the moon base sequence. So those two pieces make up about an hour of the film, and they're just set up, really. Once we get to the Jupiter mission, we're kind of into Act 3, if you like, of this, but this is the bulk of the film. And this has its own mini 3-act structure. So the first part is when we meet the astronauts and we see their routine life on this vessel, because they've been doing this for months now. They've been on this flight for 18 months, and they're the only two people who are conscious, everyone else being in stasis. And HAL, of course.
I know I've never completely freed myself of the suspicion that there are some extremely odd things about this mission.
And we get a lot of exposition from this BBC interview with themselves that they watch.
We spoke with Mission Commander Dr. David Bowman and his deputy, Dr. Frank Poole. Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. How's everything going?
Marvelous. We have no complaints.
The HAL 9000 computer, whom we learned one addresses as HAL.
No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.
Now, if that's not foreshadowing, I don't know what is. The first act's turning point for this really comes when HAL says there's a problem.
I've just picked up a fault in the AE-35 unit. It's going to go 100% failure within 72 hours.
Now, this doesn't feel like a first act turning point yet, but we've established that HAL is never wrong. But he's wrong about this.
Well, hell, I'm damned if I can find anything wrong with it.
Yes. It's puzzling.
The HAL 9000 does not make mistakes. Something is not right.
I would recommend that we put the unit back in operation and let it fail.
And that results in the death of Frank Poole. That's our shit gets real midpoint moment. The entire second half now of this part of the story is Bowman going out to recover Frank's body and getting stuck outside the ship.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
That is our second act turning point, all is lost moment. Once Dave manages to get back into the ship, we're now into Act 3 of this section of the story. And this climaxes with the message that only HAL knew.
18 months ago, the first evidence of intelligent life off the Earth was discovered.
Now we come to what is really part 4 of the story, which is when Bowman goes out to investigate the monolith, falls into it, effectively, through the Stargate, in that famous sequence, of course, and ends up here, in an imperfect recreation of a French Restoration house. Now, this is the part that many people get confused about, and you may have seen other videos explaining what this means, but in short, the aliens have set up a home for Bowman to live out his life.
His whole life passes from that point on in that room, and he has no sense of time. It just seems to happen as it does in the film. Anyway, when they get finished with him, as happens in so many myths of all cultures in the world, he is transformed into some kind of super being and sent back to Earth, transformed and made, into some sort of Superman. And we have to only guess what happens when he goes back.
In fact, if you look at the script, the ending of 2001 in the original screenplay is nothing like what we see in the film. You can see here that once HAL finishes singing Daisy, Daisy, Bowman goes and repairs the telescope and contacts Earth. And Mission Control tells him that HAL was told to lie. And that becomes the whole problem that's explained in this lengthy monologue of why HAL malfunctioned. And this is explained in 2010, the sequel. That's one of the major turning points in that film, when they realize this is what made HAL malfunction. So this whole monologue is recapping the story we've seen already. Look at all this monologue. It's just not at all dramatic. It might work in a novel, but it doesn't work in a movie. So that central Jupiter mission is where the heart of the story is, because that's the human story. That's the confrontation between Bowman and HAL. So if our A plot is the first contact with this intelligent species who wants to make contact with us when we're ready, what's the B plot? We don't have a strong character B plot in this. We don't have one continuous character going from beginning to end, in fact. The character is humanity. And at the very end, Bowman represents humanity to the aliens. But to the extent that we do have an interpersonal relationship driving this film, that is the relationship between Bowman and the antagonist, HAL. Why did HAL make a mistake? And why did he go to such lengths to kill off the crew, to hide that mistake, to protect himself? The reason, of course, is that he was given conflicting orders. HAL knew about the monolith, and this is why at the beginning of this sequence, he tries to engage Bowman in a conversation about what was found on the moon, as if he really wants to talk about this, but can't.
Certainly no one could have been unaware of the very strange stories floating around before we left. Rumors about something being dug up on the moon.
HAL kind of wants to talk about it. He doesn't like holding on to this secret. He doesn't like having two conflicting mission statements. One is, it's a voyage of discovery, support the crew in any way you can. The second is, you're there to find out about the monolith, don't tell anyone. And these two conflicting orders cause HAL to kill off the crew to protect the other mission statement of protecting the information. And this is very well played out in 2010, so I do recommend watching that film as well. By the way, 2010 is a very different kind of film. It was written, produced and directed and shot by Peter Hyams. It's a very good film. The visual effects aren't nearly as good. They're good. After all, this is one of the greatest visual effects movies ever made, still to this day. So the visual effects in 2010 don't quite hold up by the same standard, but they're quite good. But the main thing with 2010 is it's a much more straightforward 3-act character-driven story. Much more accessible. It's much more of a thriller. And the geopolitical tensions that are suggested in 2001 really come to the fore in 2010.
We are scientists, you and I, Dr. Floyd. Our governments are enemies. We are not.
The A plot is fairly straightforward, which is, when will man be ready for first contact? Once they reach Jupiter, we think they're ready. There is no theme in the traditional sense that I usually talk about, which is, what's the underpinning concept that drives the central character's growth arc? What is their journey? What is the thing that at the beginning they are not in accord with, that by the end, hopefully, if it's a happy ending, they are in accord with? This doesn't really have that. There is no strong emotional journey for Bowman or for humans. In the Jupiter sequence, the emotional journey there is simply a survival story. And that has nothing to do with the monolith until we get to the very end, and then Bowman sees it there and goes to investigate. Stanley Kubrick, of course, has been very mum about this. He didn't like to talk about it. But I think the theme, to the extent that we have one, is, what does it mean to be a civilized species? And as long as war and fighting is our answer to everything, we are not really a civilized species. By the time we reach Jupiter, the aliens are hoping we are beyond that. But again, as we find in 2010, we are not. And while this wasn't the first serious science fiction film ever made, there were some very notable ones before this. The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, Things to Come, going back to the 1930s, even War of the Worlds, which was for the time a big budget science fiction film. This was the first mainstream sci-fi film that had a more philosophical approach to space travel and first contact. In many ways, the monolith represents both technology, a very sophisticated alien advanced technology, and also a spiritual beacon. Whenever humans interact with that monolith, in the dawn of man, on the moon, and then especially outside Jupiter, it becomes a spiritual experience. The film asks a question, but doesn't fully answer it. And that's kind of the point. Most films set up a question, and then by the end, they answer that question, which is what the theme is about. This one sets up a question and leaves it up to you to work out your own answer. That was Kubrick's genius, even though the script gave us an answer, and 2010 gives us a clearer answer. Kubrick didn't want to make it that clear-cut. Hence, all that narration was gone. Hence, any reference to the atomic weapons floating above Earth was gone, and it became much more a story of human evolution. So that's my take on 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you'd like to learn more about filmmaking, check out my book linked in the description. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
Sooner or later, we expect we will receive proof that other intelligence exists in this universe. This may come next week. It may not come for 100 years. But I think this movie will serve, besides its purpose as entertainment, it may help to prepare the human race for something that inevitably will come.